Hello, everyone. Welcome to my room. Hope you're having a good weekend. Um, Today, we're going to be talking about the topic of the shadow and reflections that were inspired in part by an exchange I had with YouTuber Joyce Meng, who some of whom will be familiar with Joyce. Um, it is possible that I'll be taking part in an interview with her and probably some other participants in the near future on the topic of the relationship between the INFJ and ENFP, the shadows of each other. Um, Now, before I move on, just to remind you that I've written in the last 2 years written two books: the Ecstatic Soul, the reference book on the INFJ personality, only less than $10, links below, and my new novel, The Infinite Castle, which is a really nice product if you're interested in supporting my work in fiction, if you like fiction, and apparently the main character is an INFJ, so probably on the rather kind of tortured, unhealthy side, but nevertheless, The Infinite Castle, also less than $10. All the links are below. Thank you for your support. Um, the the topic of the shadow is one that interests a lot of people, and yet over the years I have tended, as some of you may know if you've been following me for a while, I have tended to view it with a certain amount of skepticism. I think you could say that. Part of the reason why I've been treating it with some skepticism is that that the concept of a shadow function, to me, is a slippery one. It's a difficult one to quite grasp. I mean, at first sight, if we're looking at it in an own analytical sense, concept of a shadow function is not that complicated. At least it doesn't look like it's so complicated. It's essentially a hypothesis which exists. It's not as closely derived from Jung as one might think. It's probably derived from people who followed in the footsteps of Jung, but not from the works of Jung himself. And the hypothesis essentially says that we have shadow functions that in some sense are the inverse reflection of our normal cognitive function stack functions. So once you've said that, you can refine your definition of the shadow by saying that the shadow is that part of ourself that we are repressing because we dislike it, because it makes us feel negative emotion, because we're ashamed of it, because we are afraid of it, because it represents what we consider to be our less palatable side, our ugly side. And this side, which is a side of ourself, which has certain qualities, certain properties, which says something about us, but is nevertheless not something that we want to show, either to other people or to ourselves, is the shadow. And so that's one hypothesis that you find in Jung very explicitly, but the further hypothesis that you do not find in Jung is the hypothesis that says, well, this part of yourself that you're not, that you don't want to, display, uncover to anyone, including yourself, has its own cognitive apparatus, and the cognitive apparatus is the inverse of your function stack. So in the case of the INFJ, the hypothesis says, well, instead of NIFETISE, we're looking at NEFITESI, and that is the ENFP. Hence, ENFP and INFJ shadows of each other, because obviously if you're an ENFP, you're going to have an INFJ shadow in this sense. And when you say an INFJ shadow, it means that the shadow of an ENFP is going to be equipped with the cognitive functions of an INFJ type. So, this further hypothesis, which is not in Jung, is what I've been viewing with suspicion. But in the past, you see, I have been expressing my skepticism by way of an argument for scientificity. So essentially saying that the reason why attributing cognitive functions to someone's shadow is hopeless in some sense, because it can never be verified. It can never be empirically determined. So in some sense, it's condemned to be a hypothesis outside of the realm of empirical verification. Whether you want to call it non-science or pseudoscience, these labels are a little bit annoying, so I try not to use them too much. But it's certainly not something that can ever be concretely addressed in the same way that you can concretely meet someone and at least, have a go at saying, okay, this person maybe that I've just met at work or a friend of a friend seems an INFJ, and then you try to work out, why do you think they are INFJ, or why do you think they're ENFP? And you make your observations, and then you share them with other people, and they might agree, they might not agree, but at least you have this exchange. In the case of the shadow, that's just not possible. You just can't do that. And so those were my doubts, and to some extent they still exist, but in recent months I've come to look at the conversation around the shadow and broader conversations in the personality community sphere with a little bit of more openness, a little bit more flexibility. I've started to look at different discourses within different model communities as using their vocabularies to to enrich the conversation, rather than trying to look at which one is better because they're more scientific or something like that. So there are certainly theories with vocabularies that are more scientific and that aim to be more scientific. Now, those theories have no room whatsoever for the shadow, so we have to make it clear. But then you can have conversations that are less geared towards scientific acceptability, more geared towards, again, an enrichment of the vocabulary by which we can describe our experiences, in which concepts that are not scientifically determinable are acceptable, because scientificity is actually not really one of the conditions for the worthiness of the set theory. And in the YouTube personality community, the scientific theory side of things is actually relatively minor. It's a real thing, and hopefully it will grow because it has a lot of potential, especially with cognitive typology. But there's still massive room, and there will continue to exist massive room for conversations that explore the more inaccessible, empirically anyway, inaccessible side of personality analysis, and the shadow is one of them. So from this viewpoint, now that I'm looking at it through the lens of that vocabulary, I'm no longer feeling skepticism for those scientific reasons. Because it's, in a certain sense, it's looking at it the wrong way. It's not being part of the correct language game, as Wittgenstein would say. Not playing the correct language game. But I still want to say that the concept of the shadow, in whatever vocabulary you choose to deploy it, it's still a little bit problematic to me. And I want to share some of these considerations. They are considerations that I will share with Joyce and with the other guests when we come to have that conversation. Perhaps they will have evolved since then, partly through some exchanges with you in the conversation thread below to this video. But as hopefully is understood now, these doubts and that the skepticism that I'm still feeling is no longer going to be expressed in terms of scientific respectability. They're going to be expressed in a way that is probably more informed by by some self-exploration I've been doing, through some therapy that I've been doing with an actual psychotherapist since February of this year, and it's a really great experience. It's really helping me, and that therapist is great, for me anyway. And obviously part of this is for my own self-work, but I'm deriving insights that go beyond that. I cannot help doing it. It's just in my nature too. And well, you see, I've come to realize that therapists, and no doubt this is influenced to a large extent by Jung, because Jung influences the practice of psychotherapy, obviously. I mean, it doesn't even bear repeating. The concept of shadow work is quite common one, like therapists talk about shadow work. It's one of the concepts in their arsenal. And it's one of the concepts that they use if they provide, let's say, some guidance to a client. They might encourage the client to do some shadow work. So you have here a very concrete example of the concept, or at least the word, being deployed in a very institutionalized, practical environment with consequences, real life consequences. So obviously I became very interested in exploring that further. But it really turns out that when you do shadow work, at least from the psychotherapist's point of view, what you're doing is obviously not trying to think in terms of what your type is and what your shadow type might be, and trying to come to understand that shadow type through the inverted function stack lens. It's not something to do. And most people who go to therapy probably have no idea about MBTI, and they're never going to be asked to learn about MBTI before they can do some shadow work. You can do shadow work without any knowledge of MBTI. The reason being that shadow work is really about exploring that side of yourself that you repress, that you do not recognize, you don't acknowledge it for the reasons we gave earlier. Now, because there is so much repression going on, a lot of your judgments about that shadow side initially are somewhat impenetrable, because it's a lot of the game, so to speak, is about trying to pretend that there is no such side. It's repressed, it doesn't exist. So there's no judgment about it. So the goal, if you like, of shadow work, one of the goals anyway, is to manage to unpack those judgments, which are actually in existence, are negative judgments. They could be such judgments as, I really hate this, or I dislike this, I'm ashamed of this, this is gross, this is disgusting, this is weak. These are all types of judgments that we can make about our shadow. But because there's so much repression going on, they're usually repressed. Shadow work brings them to the surface by focusing on that side of us, often through meditation, or at least focused mindfulness, spending time just, you close your eyes and you attempt to see how you feel, and internally explore those parts of yourself where it doesn't seem to feel great to think about them. So here the role of emotion is fundamental, because emotions including negative emotions, are still saying a lot about what you're repressing and the reasons why you're repressing it. In these cases, thought will usually tell you nothing, because thought is extremely easy to either to repress, to cancel, to mislead by turning a thought into another one. So self-deception is very, very easy with thought. But self-deception, when it comes to how you're feeling, is harder, because if you look deeply enough, you'll start noticing those emotions that are unpleasant, that you don't want to feel, and so you busy yourself with other things so that you ignore that you're feeling them. That's shadow work. And so progressively you start to understand better what those emotions are, what those judgments are, and part of the work is trying to move from those really negative judgments to a position of acceptance, to learn to accept that those emotions exist, even if they're negative, even if they're really wounding. is to really just care for them and to kind of check in with yourself and say, I'm here for you, instead of, I really dislike you and I'm going to hide you away. Now that's shadow work. And I think that from this perspective, you can probably understand why it's hard to imagine that, at least prima facie, it's hard to imagine that a shadow would have a cognitive function stack, because surely that side of yourself, for each individual, that side of yourself that fits the definitions or the descriptions I've been giving, is going to vary immensely from person to person, and even from INFJ to INFJ, from ENFP to ENFP. No two INFJs will be alike in terms of that side of them that they are, is their shadow, because they will have different traumas, because they will have different life stories. And clearly the shadow and what articulates the contours of the shadow in the case of each person is very closely connected to trauma, to periods of our life that were very difficult, where there's a lot of negative emotion added up, and so that we're just keeping buried. So to move from that to the idea that this part of ourselves, which is very, very individual according to our life experiences and our environments and so on, to move from this, which I think is fairly acceptable and a good realization, to saying that in addition, that part has a cognitive function stack, just sounds wild to me at the moment. It sounds wild to me, because how could you tell? How could you tell what function stack they have? You barely understand your shadow, and you will never completely understand it. You will come to accept it before you can understand it, because so much of the acceptance and the mediations between the two sides, the conscious self and the shadow, is true and is regulated by emotion. All of these things are emotion, because thought is not reliable. But when you try to apply a grade of cognitive functions, you're using thought, you're not using emotion. But nevertheless, it's still a hypothesis that I don't think has been defeated by this video. And I'm open to changing my mind and exploring how we can come to understand why a shadow, and how it could have an actual function stack. And so I'm looking forward to your comments. Enjoy the rest of your day, guys. It's a beautiful day here, and I hope it is where you are as well. Don't forget, you can also follow me and support me on Patreon. That would be beautiful and really appreciate it. See you soon, guys. Bye-bye.